Bob Mueller speaks. So do Jussie Smollett's arrest records and reports on Biden, Kamala Harris, and Fauxcahontas herself, Elizabeth Warren, on this episode of The Uprising.
LbertyNation.com. They're the resistance, but we are the uprising. With Scott Cosenza.
I felt this thrill going up my leg.
There's not going to be a President Donald Trump.
A president! Can you believe it?
This is somebody who knows what's right and what's wrong.
You know what podcasts are, by the way?
Talk shows for people who cannot make it in talk radio.
I just want to say to the men of this country, just shut up, do the right thing for a change.
I think possibly that's the most unattractive form in which prejudice can be met in this country, is the rage of the entitled.
Welcome back to The Uprising, a podcast of LbertyNation.com, your home for high-quality conservatarian news analysis, written, audio, video, you name it, we got it. Go to LbertyNation.com for all those needs. And I'm your host, Scott David Cosenza, and we're going to shop it up with a little Bob Mueller. We've got a Biden report on deck for you with Mr. Tim Donner, and we're going to talk about Fauxcahontas for a minute, and some craziness from Kamala Harris, which I haven't seen it get any press, but it's one of these stories where you wonder why isn't the world shouting about this? And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about Mr. Jussie Smollett, who's had another bad week in the news. Well, if we turn our attention to the Bob Mueller press conference, and I'm going to play just a quick snippet. The big takeaway I thought was how bad Bob Mueller is at a press conference. The stammering, stuttering. You wonder what was that about. But more importantly, what did he say? He said nothing at all of any import. He did not deviate from the things that he said in the printed Mueller report. And the one important piece of news I thought that came out of that was really just that he announced he would refuse to testify in front of Congress beyond saying anything he has already said in the Mueller report. Now, how he's going to be able to do that and avoid a contempt charge in front of Jerry Nadler if he gets out of the hospital long enough to ask those questions is that remains to be seen. But Mueller was adamant about that point. But there is one clip that I thought was indicative of the whole investigation, and it shows the problematic nature of the special counsel's office and the whole shebang, really.
If we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so.
The problem with that statement, which is mirrors a statement in the printed report, is that that's not what prosecutors do. Prosecutors don't discover innocence, and in fact, no investigator can discover innocence of something. You establish somebody's innocence by discovering guilt. Now, that's if you know a crime was committed. So, for instance, somebody gets murdered, and we want to establish that person A did not commit that murder. The thing to do is not go about trying to establish that. It's going about us trying to establish who did, in fact, commit the murder. What you can actually get evidence of that. And if you can definitively prove it, which is possible, then you can exonerate person A. But that's not what we had here because there was, in fact, no crime to begin with. There was no collusion to begin with. It was all made up. Whether it was made up at a high level in furtherance of Hillary Clinton's campaign or something else, hopefully we'll learn that soon, definitively. But prosecutors should either bring charges or shut up. That's their appropriate role, to say we were unable to develop evidence indicating proof beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody committed a crime. So we stopped talking about it, because where do you go to sort of defend yourself against this failure to prove a negative? Well, okay, we don't need to spend a mountain of time on it, but so Mr. Mueller is closing his office and will end his employ in our Justice Department. Well, I think it's unlikely that Donald Trump is going to be rid of questions presented by Mueller regarding Mueller for the rest of his presidency. And somebody else who has a bit of a troublesome question that follows her around is Elizabeth Warren, Fauxcahontas, if you will. She was on the Breakfast Club podcast, and if you don't know that, it is one of the major black podcasts that's out there. It's well done, and they get a lot of high-profile people. Kamala Harris, you may remember we played the clip. That's where she said that she liked to smoke marijuana because she was Jamaican, and some other, well, I won't characterize the statements, interesting statements. And Elizabeth Warren was on the Breakfast Club this week. The questioner is Charlemagne the God. I don't believe he bears any family history with the King of the Franks or the Emperor of the Romans, Charlemagne. But in any case, he is a great direct questioner in interviews. I like him very much, and he just poses it right to her. And it is a total Schadenfreude moment, because I so detest the progressive anti-liberty policies of Elizabeth Warren. I am just generally happy when something bad usually happens. But it is kind of like you do have almost a moment of sympathy for her, that she just can't get away from this. And she keeps saying the same thing over and over again, which is so hilarious, which is that she's not a member of a tribe, and only tribes determine tribal citizenship. That's what she said when she first started answering this question. I think if I were going to ask Elizabeth Warren a question, I would preface it by saying, you don't have to say that you're not a member of a tribe and only tribes determine tribal citizenship. Without saying that, can you please answer this question? But here's Charlemagne.
I want to clear up some stuff, because you know there's a lot of criticism that's said about you, so I want to give you the opportunity to speak on these things. The Native American thing. Do you regret taking the DNA test?
Look, I can't go back, but...
You know, you got to explain to a lot of people that don't know. Now, you came out and said that you were Native American. And,
long ago.
And found out that you weren't. And people were very upset about that.
This ain't for the people who don't know.
No, but a lot of people don't
have that much time.
Because we're putting people up to her as well, so go ahead.
So I grew up in Oklahoma. I learned about my family the same way most people learn about their family, from my mama and my daddy and my aunts and my uncles. And it's what I believe. But I'm not a person of color. I'm not a citizen of a tribe. And I shouldn't have done it.
She refuses to say whether she regrets it or not. That's a great line. Well, I can't go back. Well, nobody's asking if you had a time machine or access to one. That would be pretty big news, Ms. Warren. But how about my mama and my daddy? This is a woman who is less than a month away from her 70th birthday, and she says mama and daddy. And I guess the problem for me is, I just think that if it was not an election, if she wasn't running for president, she would say mother and father. Mama and daddy just seem so disingenuous. All right, back to Charlemagne.
How long did you hold on to that? Because there was some report that said you were a Native American on your Texas bar license, and that you said you were a Native American on some documents when you were a professor at Harvard. Like, why'd you do that?
So it's what I believe. You know, that's, like I said, it's what I learned from my family.
When did you find out you weren't?
Well, you know, I'm not a person of color. I'm not a citizen of a tribe. And tribal citizenship is an important distinction, and not something I am. So
she keeps answering this question that nobody's asked, which is, are you a member of a tribe? No, nobody's saying that. And the best part was that question, if you didn't pick it up on it, was basically what he said was, when did you find out you were white, lady? She doesn't think she is. That's she's still living in Fantasyland with her DNA test. All right, last one.
Was there any benefits to that?
No. Boston Globe did a full investigation. It never affected, nothing about my family ever affected any job I ever got.
She didn't get a discount in college? No.
You kind of like the original Rachel Dolezal a little bit. Rachel Dolezal was a white woman pretending to be black.
No, this is what I learned from my family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She also refuses to give herself a robust defense. This kind of like, well, yeah. You know, half the time when you hear one of these political pundits on TV give advice to somebody who you think they don't want to win office, they're not actually giving genuine advice. They're giving, fake advice. But I don't do that. I'm giving the genuine advice, the real article. Elizabeth Warren, somebody, I'm sure that given the vast network of Uprising listeners, somebody's got her ear. Go ahead and pull her aside. Here's the advice for you, Senator Warren, free of charge from me to you. The next time you say that, you say, I was lied to. I was told something that wasn't true. I then repeated that. I didn't make it up. I'm not Rachel Dolezal. Rachel Dolezal tried to trick people. I was tricked. Now, I don't necessarily think any of that is true, but if that's your story, you should be a little bit more assertive about it. If only to add that air of authenticity to the story. The other thing is how quick she is to say, no, I got no improper benefit from it, which I appreciated Charlemagne zeroing in on. That reply came fast and furious. The Boston Globe, well, if the Boston Globe says that the Democrat senator from Massachusetts is kosher, then we know. Purer than Caesar's wife, to be sure. What we don't know is, what we do know is, for sure, in the institutions of higher learning, in Harvard University, at the University of Pennsylvania, to be a woman of color is to be like a unicorn. A woman of color who, by the way, wasn't hired as part of some diversity set-aside, but because of her merit academically. It's unheard of in these places, and that's the reason why she was so successful, in part. And that's, of course, the reason why she put it down, is because you get unearned benefit by virtue of these immutable characteristics. It's exactly the stated goal of the progressives and anti-racists and types, is to eliminate those unearned privileges that Elizabeth Warren got. Well, she is, I think, number 3rd in the polls, and to jump to number 1 in the poll for who will be the Democrat nominee to challenge President Trump, assuming he's still president. Let's spend some time with Tim Donner. Welcome back to The Uprising, a podcast of LbertyNation.com, our immediate past co-host.
I was hoping I could slip that in before you said immediate past.
And the official Joe Biden for President correspondent to the podcast. How are you?
Well, it's caused great disruption in my life, to be honest with you, because as I've said on more than one occasion, it's required me to basically renege on all other commitments I've made in my life in order to be as immediate past and former, as you said, co-host of the show.
Are the reports
to be moved to
camping
this
to
lofty?
Claymont, Delaware?
It's actually, it's actually, I take it as actually a promotion to go from being co-host to being the Biden correspondent.
Lunchbox Joe, Scranton, Pennsylvania, next president of the United States.
Yes, indeed.
What has the past week seen with our front runner, for sure, for challenging Donald Trump in the next presidential election?
Well, he's expanded his lead. It seems to be, he's added a couple more points to his already the gaping hole between him and second place runner-up right now, Bernie Sanders.
Who do you think is making a good, I'm just saying, though, there's millions of polls out there. Is there one that you rely on that you think they're really solid?
Rasmussen.
Okay.
Rasmussen was the only one that called the 2016 election properly, other than the LA Times tracking poll, which is an interesting thing we'll talk about more, because they use a different methodology, but they were dead on target about the 2016 election. But I generally like Rasmussen. The rest of them, pretty unsteady.
And where are things now for Uncle Joe with the Rasmussen poll?
He's well, in this case, Rasmussen hasn't actually conducted a poll yet on the Democratic primary, Scott, but all the other ones are within a point or two of each other. Morning Consult, The Hill, Monmouth, Quinnipiac, Morning Consult, which is a very good poll, by the way, Morning Consult. They all have Biden up between 18 and 20 points. And we talked about it last week. I mean, it can't be because Joe Biden is such a sterling candidate.
Well, let me interrupt with another question.
Can it?
Is that 18 to 20% in a particular state, or is it just general?
National.
Okay, so it's a national.
But it's similar
Does it
in New
track
Hampshire.
in Iowa and New Hampshire with that?
It tracks
Okay.
pretty well.
Okay.
Sanders a little closer in Iowa than in New Hampshire, strangely enough, because he's a senator from the neighboring state of Vermont. But he's expanded his lead. But in the other Biden news this week, did you know that he once again got into the soup with a 10-year-old girl? You did not know
What are
that?
you talking
Yes,
about?
yes. American Federation of Teachers held an event in Houston, and the former vice president was
kidding me?
asked a question by a 10-year-old girl. She said, "How divided is the U.S. right now?" And Biden gave a long, rambling answer, talked about immigration, promised her that he'd write a formal letter on the subject to her, etc. And then he leaned to talk to her and shake her hand and said, "I bet you're as bright as you are good looking." And then after learning that the girl's interested in becoming a journalist, here's the good part, Biden took her over, put his hand on her shoulder, and took a picture of her with somebody from the Associated Press. I mean, you know, it's just Joe being Joe, lunch bucket Joe being
Did she have
creepy Joe.
Did she have the expression on her face like Chris Coon's daughter?
Please get away
get this
from
creepy
me.
old dude away from me.
There's not much photographic evidence.
Oh, well, that's key to his reelection, I think.
Yeah, well, there's not up close anyway. There's not enough to capture any visible anguish on the part of the girl.
Tim, what do you attribute the bump in the bump in the polls? Is it just lackluster performance from everybody else? I mean, he hasn't.
Well, you could say name recognition, but at this point, it's probably a little bit more than that. I think it's the perception among the Democrat voters writ large, not just the radical base, but the rank and file Democrats, the blue collar Democrats, the ones largely that Trump won over in order to win the election in 2016.
The general election Democrat voters.
Yeah, the
rather
general
than the
election Democrat
primary,
voters.
right.
And again, what are they most concerned about? Probably what they should be, which is beating Donald Trump.
Right.
And they perceive, I think is a better way to put it, that Joe Biden gives them the best chance to beat Donald Trump. And they don't, and those voters they really don't care about idea. The only ideology they want is he's not Trump. That's pretty much all that matters, because you could never form a solid basis of an argument for why Joe Biden is the right person to lead the United States of America.
Author of the crime bill.
Yeah, well, that's
Hey, Tim, I think you're devaluating his solid 8 years as number two. Okay.
By the way, speaking of number two, and then we'll get to
when I think of number two, I think of Joe Biden. Yeah, certainly.
Well, Greenpeace, which is about the most radical worldwide environmental wacko organization that exists on the planet.
That
Wouldn't
has
you
some
say?
respect. I mean, Earth First, I think, is worse. But those are the people who used to spike the trees and blow up the Hummers.
Right, and Greenpeace is engaged in acts of eco-terrorism. We know that, or they have endorsed it. Joe Biden was ranked the second worst of the 24 Democrat candidates in terms of the environment and climate change by Greenpeace. Now, I'm presaging what the other candidates are going to bring up in that first debate coming up next month, and we'll talk a little bit more about the third debate. But so he's got some work to do on climate change to convince these radical environmentalists that he's really on their side. He got a D- from Greenpeace.
I don't know if you've ever been through Delaware, Tim, but the DuPont company has something to say about what goes on with their elected officials in that state. And I don't think they have quite the green thumb when it comes to
So Joe Biden would have a chemical addiction, but not to something that he puts in his body, but in his bank account.
It's that. Well, it's funny you mentioned bank account, because that's the other major industry in Wilmington that I think controls banking interests.
Yes, that's true.
And those other interests.
That's correct. Now I have along the lines of whether Biden has an appeal to the base and the party. While there are all of these blue-collar Democrats, rank and file that we talked about before, there's obviously a significant percentage of true progressives that form the radical base of the party, or else these 24 candidates wouldn't be going out there and endorsing the Green New Deal, which would bankrupt the country.
This is the race to win the primary.
There's a race to win the primary.
These are in the general. I don't think they do present a significant numbers percentage.
I would agree with you,
but certainly in the primary they do.
But Biden was making one of his well spaced out campaign appearances. He's got a very, very light campaign schedule. Right? I think he's sitting on his lead, and he figures nobody's threatening him right now. Right. The best thing to do is not go out there and blow it by saying something
stupid. Gaffes or touching a female inappropriately.
Which he just did this week, of course.
Right.
But he was in Texas for a campaign event, and somebody stuck a microphone in front of a couple of progressive Democratic voters in Texas, one of whom was a white woman, the other of whom was a black man. And I think it was interesting what their take was and what the problem that Biden is going to have with the Democrats' left-wing base. Here it is.
I don't think you beat something so far right with something so middle ground. Joe Biden is very middle ground for me, and I think you need something a little more far left to combat that.
Yeah, he's Uncle Joe. Everybody likes their fluffy uncle. But he's Barack Obama's friend. He's got the cool black friend, right? That's all it is. Joe has a terrible history in the black community, and everybody just loves him because he's the fluffy old guy. He has given us no policies, and I like Joe Biden, but he's just not.
Like it.
I do like Joe Biden as a vice president.
Okay, so there you go. I do like Joe Biden, and you know what? I think all these people who know Joe Biden and respect him have been saying or implying, if you read between the lines, that I really like the guy. He's a terrific guy. I hope he doesn't run for president. Mm-hmm. Okay, he's
maybe Stacey Abrams will pick him to be her vice president.
That could be. She'd be looking for a septuagenarian white male to run as her running mate, right?
Well, she would be stunning and brave as a candidate. That's all I know, Tim.
Where are those Democrat? Can I get on the list for those Democratic talking points that you've been getting?
Stunning and brave is all you need to know. Okay.
But interesting that the black man in that soundbite said Joe Biden has a terrible history in the black community. Now, I hadn't thought of it that way. He's thought to be way ahead in the critical South Carolina primary, where black voters are particularly important. It propels the candidates to Super Tuesday, which is shortly thereafter. And Biden has been thought to have great support among African Americans because he was Obama's vice president. He was loyal to him. Right. He did anything Obama wanted him to do, which is what a vice president does. But here, a terrible history in the black community, and that makes me think, Scott, that the whole issue of this crime bill is going to be relitigated in a totally different political climate than it was in the 90s when it had bipartisan support.
Absolutely. Yes, it did. One of the few groups that I know of that was vehemently and vigorously opposed to it was the Libertarians, and I was part of that fight. It was this idea, and I've heard Biden, even Archie the podcasting dog is animated. He's getting
his dander up on this. He remembers.
The thing is, it wasn't like one of these things where like, oh, well, nobody could have seen that coming. Nobody could have seen the destruction of the black community accelerated massively by this crime bill. Plenty of us, I saw it coming. Plenty of people saw it coming. And I didn't see it coming because I'm a genius. I saw it coming because plainly that's where the history of prohibition has gotten us. If you want to ramp it up, you're increasing the prohibition premium. You combine that with the lack of opportunity in the inner cities in largely black and brown populations. Well, the reaction is clear, and let's also build jail cells as far as the eye can see, or prison cells rather, and have an unlimited capacity for that incarceration.
And it was all done for Clinton to prove that he was tough on crime, that he wasn't soft, he wasn't a soft liberal. I mean, it worked for him. He won twice on a centrist message.
As the key to getting him. Mm-hmm. You got to remember about Ricky Ray Rector. Now, Ricky Ray Rector is a guy who either killed somebody or was with another person who killed somebody. Pretty horrible crime he committed. And also, he tried to kill himself. And when he did so, he shot himself through the brain and didn't die. But what resulted was a man who had a childlike affectation and didn't remember the crime that he committed. So he was basically like a mentally retarded person in prison who did commit a horrible crime. But why would no real liberal, Tim, would ever say that this person should be executed? He didn't understand why he was being put to death. And just to give you an example, it's so, I mean, I hate to even say it because it's so awful when you just the reality of it. He asked for his final meal for some of it to be set aside so that he could eat it later. So
that sort of proves it right there.
This shows how this person doesn't understand.
Yeah.
And Bill Clinton flew home on the campaign trail, flew back to Arkansas to sign the death warrant for a black fellow, by the way, Ricky Ray Rector, so that he could have this bona fides as a tough on crime guy. Because you're right, that's what that was one of the perceived big weaknesses of it, that he would be a soft on crime liberal.
I wonder if Joe Biden pulled out the same kind of thing that Bill Clinton did in 1992 with Sister Souljah, if it would go over quite so well now as it did back then, when Clinton famously criticized, I wouldn't say attacked, but criticized Sister Souljah, who was a cultural icon in the black community at the time, saying that she was being divisive or something like that.
It was
he
like
did
on
that
a panel,
to prove,
basically, and she said something that was mildly outrageous at the time, that was anti-police, I think.
Right.
And he basically said, "Hey, now let's not get," and it was just that kind of level of intensity.
Now
it wasn't
let's
like,
not do this.
Right. And he got a lot of credit. Almost like a conservative type credit, right? Like, oh, well, he's the adult in the room kind of credit for that. Yeah, I don't think if Joe Biden said to Meek Mill, who's probably the modern day equivalent, hey, it's not always racism if, you don't get into the nightclub or something like that. Yeah, that would be. I think he would probably lose the Democrat primary based on that type of statement with today's mind.
Certainly
with what's in the air.
Certainly. I guess honestly, Scott. Biden seems like a fairly decent human being and everything, but I have to say that my opinion of him has never recovered from the time before he actually announced, where he made a speech where he mentioned that he thought Vice President Mike Pence was a decent guy. Mm-hmm. And then some left-wing activist tweeted something, and an hour later he apologized for calling the Vice President Mike Pence, who is a decent guy, a decent guy. How much political courage does it take to simply not apologizing for calling someone who's a political opponent, Hitler?
Yeah, I find so much odious about Joe Biden's political stances. When he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I have a lot of memories about how he handled himself and the criticisms that he gave judges. Famously, it's so funny. It's actually not famous at all. It's famous in my mind, though. It's like I have this image in my mind of him holding up the book Takings by Richard Epstein, which was a screed against when government takes people's land without just compensation. Mm-hmm. And Biden just challenging this like it was somehow outrageous. There was a very interesting case, Tim, I think it was in the Carolinas, where a guy had bought several acres of beachfront property, basically. And after he bought it, the town was like, oh, by the way, you can't develop any beachfront property anymore. And he said, okay, fine. Give me the, whatever it was, millions of dollars that I paid for this. Like, oh, no. We're not going to pay you.
You can use it for something else.
You can still stand on it and look at the ocean. And the push from those of us on the sort of libertarianist side and conservatives as well is, well, the takings clause of the Constitution requires that even though you don't. So they were arguing that because they didn't take the title to the land, right, they just massively restricted its use, that this wasn't a taking.
Right.
And it's just so gross and disgusting.
It's a virtual taking.
Yeah, it's just so gross and disgusting. Why won't you pay that man for his land? And the reason why is they want the benefit of basically stealing his land without the burden that the law requires.
In other words, they want the taxes paid on it every year.
Oh, yes.
Right, and they want the
absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So those are the reasons why I think Biden is just. Well, I've got lots of problems with Uncle Joe. But you said something a couple minutes ago that I thought was interesting. You mentioned Super Tuesday. So sort of the mechanics of the race, I think, are a little bit interesting as well. And we talked about off the air this Politico story about how a person gets into the nationally televised Democrat primary debates and how some of the challenges may now benefit Joe Biden. So what do you see there?
Well, what they've done is they've set up a series of debates beginning by the time people are listening to this, it'll already be June, right? So this month in June will be the first debate. There's another one in July, and then there's a third one in September. So the first two has a very low threshold because there's 24 candidates. They have to set a threshold. You and I could just declare that we're candidates for president and get up on the debate stage? No, I don't think so. However, the threshold is low. It's 1% in a conglomerate of the approved polls that they use to determine.
Right.
And it's a certain number of individual donors that you have to have had. Not total money raised, but number of individual donors.
Is that a new metric for inclusion?
I believe it is.
Okay, 'cause I read that as well, and I had not seen it.
The Republicans,
I don't
think the Republicans did it in 2016.
I'll tell you, my first thought when I read that was, okay, so you're placing a huge value on individual. So what that means is that instead of going after the large donors, they'll just go after individual ones. It's not a genuine metric if you set it out ahead of time, because now I'm just working to that goal.
But what they're trying to do is avoid some candidate going out and getting someone to contribute a huge amount of money.
The Koch brothers gave them $1 billion.
Yeah, now I'm not sure.
Else.
I'm actually not sure whether that includes PAC money too, because that, of course, is supposed to be hands off from the actual.
Individual just means an individual.
I think individual,
American.
Yeah.
So subject to the double max requirement.
And if you're Beto O'Rourke or someone like that who's sort of in the first tier, you're going to make the cut, but you're not doing well. I mean, what you have to do to make sure you get in the debates is get people to contribute $1.
Right. That's
send $1, send $2, and that will. But what happens, that's the first two debates.
Well, let me interrupt and say this. And I think what will happen is, let's say I'm hot for one of these candidates. For me right now, it would probably be, who's the one from Hawaii?
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard, I would guess, is probably my favorite candidate among the announced. I would say to my mom, my nieces and nephews, and family, hey, do me a real solid here. Would you please give $5 to Tulsi Gabbard? It would really help out. Even because of that metric. And so it's not a measure of support. It's just a measure of who can generate, $1 here and $1 there. But before we go on, I want to ask you, how many, you said, is it 24?
24.
24. What percent of the 24 do you think have 1% now?
Well, what I do know is what number of the candidates have 2%, because that's what then is needed for the third debate. When we get into the fall, it gets serious. Okay, so these first two, it's a low threshold. They're going to do the debates on back-to-back days so that they have 2 stages of 10 or 12. They'll do that in July again.
2 heats?
2 heats, yes. The 2 semifinal heats.
Right.
And they'll do basically the same thing in July. But when we get to the ABC debate in September, the threshold now goes up to 2% and double the amount of individual donors. And I think that number is about 57,000 donors you have to have for the first 2 debates. It's going to go up to about double that, over 100,000, for the third debate. So they're going to start to cull the herd a little bit by the time they get to the fall.
What's your prediction? By debate number 3, we're going to have how many candidates on that debate stage?
Well, I do have right now, here are the candidates, only a third of the field, 8 of the 24 meet the 2% threshold right now.
Mm-hmm.
That would be Biden, Sanders, Fauxcahontas, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Cory Booker, Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you.
Did I do that
Yes,
properly?
sir.
Yes. And Beto Robert Francis O'Rourke. Those are the only 8, which means that the following 16 candidates, as of now, do not qualify. I thought I'd put Bill de Blasio first, just because it would be good to have him lead the pack. I put Eric Swalwell second, the far left congressman from California.
Take your guns.
Take your guns and then aim them at Donald Trump. Probably Jay Inslee, John Hickenlooper, Steve Bullock, Michael Bennett, Seth Moulton, Tim Ryan, Kirsten Gillibrand. Boy, what an exercise in futility her campaign has been.
Can you imagine stroking a check to her?
Oh, my God.
For what?
How embarrassing. I wouldn't tell anybody. I wouldn't admit. No. Hey, I didn't give to her.
It's a
Must
matter,
have been
it's a
someone
matter
else.
of public record.
Someone else with my same name. And let's not forget, among the also-rans, unfortunately, Tulsi Gabbard is not at the 2% threshold. Neither is Julian Castro. I mean, his campaign's gone nowhere.
Do you know that a lot of the mainstream media types don't even include her when they talk about, like, they do these profiles of the women who are running?
Yeah, they barely touch it. And there are 2 additional women running as well.
I think it's because of her anti-war stuff. She's a swamp drainer in a significant way.
Oh, you're talking about Tulsi Gabbard?
Yes. What did I say?
Oh, I thought you were talking about Kirsten Gillibrand.
Oh, no.
Tulsi Gabbard, no, they don't mention her among... No, you're right. They do not, because they don't deem her to be...
It's an inconvenient truth.
And what's remarkable about it, Scott, as we've commented on this before, is that what her defining issue for the Tulsi Gabbard campaign is taking us out of foreign wars, ending foreign interventions, a much lighter touch in American foreign policy. She's alone in the field.
Like Donald Trump ran and won on.
Like he ran and won on. And you'd think that if only because she has distinguished herself from the rest of the field by talking about things that people care about, that no other candidates are talking about, that
the novelty of it,
that alone would propel her into a position where she's at least an interesting novelty candidate, but she's not even being treated as that. It's almost as if the left-wing media has given up on the traditional pacifism of the socialist left. They're no longer pacifists, Scott.
No, they're warmongers.
They are.
Yeah.
I mean, and by the way, just so we don't leave them out, let's not forget former Congressman John Delaney, Wayne Messam, the mayor of Miramar, Florida. I've never even seen an article about him. The author Marianne Williamson, who is a far left, And then there's Andrew Yang, I mean, who has fallen on hard times after getting a little bit of publicity. So there's your whole
universal
list.
basic income candidate.
Yes, the universal basic. Now, I do have one more soundbite I wanted to play, and this is going back to Biden for a second, since he is dwarfing the field. I thought this was very interesting. It was on MSNBC. And this is Mark Leibovich, who is the national correspondent for the New York Times Sunday magazine.
Okay.
And an author. I've had him on the radio show a couple times. He's a really good interview. He writes entertaining books. They move well, et cetera. He's got a lot of credibility. And he went on with an analysis of Biden, putting into context, because all the stories about Biden's big lead, Biden expands his lead, Biden's leading by even more.
Right.
He sort of provided something of a reality check.
Yes, he's a known entity. Yes, he is the Joe Biden that everyone has seen for decades on the national stage. But as a presidential candidate, he's been a monumental failure. I mean, he has run extremely unsuccessfully twice. In 1987, didn't even make it to 1988, and in 2008. Barely got to, I don't think he even got to New Hampshire in either case. I was in New Hampshire a few weeks ago. He didn't do a town meeting per se, but he did do one event at a pizza place where he took questions. And there was also a house party where he took questions. He looked out of practice. I talked to a lot of voters afterwards. He rambled quite a bit. He went from here to here to here. The notion that Joe Biden is a safe pick for Democrats goes to the assumption that this is going to come down to the lesser of two septuagenarian, undisciplined people you know.
So I thought that really kind of touched on what we've spoken about before, which is that Biden looks a step slow. He looks old. He looks like a grandfather. He looks out of practice. He looks
Well, nominating somebody because it's their turn or because
that never
you think
works
they
out
can
well.
beat the other guy is not a good.
No, that's a good point.
Look.
That's a good point.
This Bob Dole, remember, it was his turn.
Right.
Look what happened to his
Bob
candidacy.
Well, the Republicans have done this. I mean, in 2008, it was McCain's turn because he lost to Bush in 2000. That was a disaster.
Straight Talk expressed him.
Yeah,
it's not
that's
a
right.
disaster at all.
And then 2012, Romney, it was his turn because he was the runner-up to McCain in 2008. So how did that work out?
Such a gentleman.
Oh, yes, Mitt Romney. Boy, he does look the part. I'll give him that. I mean, he looked the part of a president more than because he didn't act.
Oh no,
like
he did. He had good presidential hair.
He did.
Wear a suit
he looked like he could be
nicely,
chiseled
to
right
be
into
sure.
Mount Rushmore.
Absolutely, yes. For that, I would vote. If that was the only thing to vote on, I would vote for him to be sure. All right. Well, thank you for your Biden report, and I got a lot of positive response about our abortion conversation last week, and so I thought that as we. There's going to be a lot more abortion news in the year ahead because of the pressing of the various claims. And so I think just when time warrants, because of events in the news, we should pick up our conversation again. So I just want to talk to you briefly about the Supreme Court ruling that came down this week, Planned Parenthood, Indiana. I guess I'll set the table. So the Supreme Court ruled that the Indiana law that allowed the Indiana law that requires abortion providers to dispose of the remains of aborted fetuses commensurate with the human disposal laws, which is to say they must be buried or cremated, was okay. But because of the basis that they argued the case, that's likely to be stricken down in the future. And the other thing they did was they said that the part of the law that allowed for elective abortions because of the disability status or sex or race of the fetus, Indiana had said that would be impermissible and illegal, and the Supreme Court said that you can't question that notion. And Justice Thomas wrote a very lengthy sort of side piece discussing the eugenics movement and basically saying that how vile it was that this was headed towards race selection and anti-disability selection. So, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that the necessity to force abortion providers to dispose of aborted fetuses in a respectful and dignified manner, the need to force them to do that, speaks volumes about the bulk of the pro-choice movement, which has no real respect, as I see it, for human life. It's a culture of death where you take an aborted fetus and you throw it in the garbage. I look at that as an individual attitude. I think it's very revelatory of what abortion activists, pro-abortion activists, believe about the value of life. I don't include you in that group at all.
So, right.
But I mean, I'm talking about the abortion activists, the people who will get out with signs and scream angry slogans and intimidate people on the street.
Like the people that chant for death penalties. It's like, hey, if you think that we should have to have a death penalty, that's fine, but I hope you would do it with a measure of sort of resigned sadness that it's required. Do you see those people outside the prison that are like, fry the bastard? And, it's like...
But Scott, how about the times that we've seen over the years, the number of times you've had people in New York, most famously, standing on a ledge, threatening to jump, and people shooting at the bottom, going, "Jump, jump!"
Well,
jump.
To be fair,
jump.
they're trying to get home from in traffic, so I have a little bit of sympathy for them.
You do?
Well, they're trying to get on the A train, and if the station's closed because of the hubbub.
I see.
Well, I would say that I think that is constitutionally impermissible. So while I don't celebrate that method of disposal for fetus remains, I think it's absolutely violative of the Constitution to say you have to now pay for. I mean, are they going to have a hearse and flowers? And I do mean that, that's a little bit facetious, but also when you drive up the cost, I mean, that does drive up the cost of an abortion to the point where some people will no longer be able to be afforded. And if it's not legally a human being, which is what our current rules say, then I think it's impermissible for the government to say to people in the populace, "Oh, we're going to stick you in a cage," and that's what this is about. This is about the criminal law, that we're going to stick you in a cage if you don't behave in a way that we think is right. And also, I think we always have to be mindful that almost all of these rules are passed precisely because they want to have the person who is having an abortion, instead of thinking of this as a fetus or an unviable tissue mass, think of this as a human being.
Yes.
And then not abort, which I think is perhaps appropriately morally, but not appropriate as a government function.
I understand, and I'd have trouble parsing your legal argument. It's just that for me, I can't get past the notion of disposing of what had been what I consider a human life in a fashion that was anything but dignified. I don't know about, it runs up the cost of abortions. I don't have a lot of sympathy for that, because other than in the cases of rape and incest, we all know what happens if you have unprotected sex. We all know what happens. I mean, where's the accountability there? Where's there any semblance of accountability that, your licentious behavior or your mistake or your whatever it is created a human life? Now, you have to be responsible for your actions. Where is there any element of that in the pro-choice movement?
All right. Well, I will take my host's privilege by having the last word on this part of the conversation for this uprising, but we will certainly pick it up as we go along. I would just say to you that it's not necessarily licentiousness that yields unwanted pregnancies, and also there are many times where birth control is not utilized properly, and it fails. And a genuine attempt.
Are we going to say many? Are we going to really say many times?
I don't think that most abortions are the result of ineffective birth control, but a significant enough number of them are that I don't think it can be swept aside.
I think the issue is when women believe that abortion can be used as a viable alternative to birth control. If they're taught to believe that, then they're not going to take the 100% that they need to prevent a pregnancy. They're not going to take that as seriously. If abortion is made so available that it becomes almost something that is encouraged by an entire ideological group of Americans who say that, we've gone from saying, as Bill Clinton did, that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, which is a nice slogan. It didn't become any more rare in his day. I don't think it
much less rare.
Safe, legal, and rare, to now where you have elements of the far left that celebrate abortion, that see it as a rite of passage, that see it as something noble, something empowering somehow. And I have to tell you, Scott, I can't begin to understand that sentiment.
I think that line of argument that you just made would be more persuasive from the pro-life side if the morning after pill and RU486 and other measures were not fought tooth and nail, so that before there was an implantation pregnancy where we really had what's medically recognized as a pregnancy, I see that that's being fought all down the line as well. So,
but the left, the abortion activists act so often as if pregnancy is a punishment for women rather than a gift to them, and that's, there's nothing you can do to force people to recognize the value of life.
You have to think that some significant universe of those women seeking abortions, they do believe that to be a punishment and a burden that they are unwilling to carry. So, all right, well, we will pick it up. Thank you so much for joining us on The Uprising, Tim. Cheers.
Cheers.
Well, thank you to Tim for, as always, engaging Biden report. Sadly, for lack of personnel and budget and everything else, the Uprising podcast does not have a dedicated Kamala Harris correspondent. So I have had to do double duty on that. And boy, when I tell you that she said something I simply cannot believe, well, I can't state it more plainly than that. She did a MSNBC town hall, and I haven't listened to the whole thing. I've only listened to a few clips, but one of them is so profoundly disturbing. It does shock me that most of the press isn't identifying this as something that simply is disqualifying. That is to say, it's so ridiculous. It evidences such a fundamental ignorance of what the job of the presidency is and how governance in the United States works when we talk about the difference between the states and the federal government. It's like she is from, she lived most of her life in Canada, I guess, before college, so maybe that's why. But it's so profoundly disturbing. Well, enough of me leading into it. Here is California Senator and former Attorney General of California, Kamala Harris, on what she's going to do to make sure that there aren't these pesky abortion laws when she's president.
When elected, I'm going to put in place and require that states that have a history of passing legislation that is designed to prevent or limit a woman's access to reproductive health care, that those laws have to come before my Department of Justice for a review and approval, and until we determine that they are constitutional, they will not take effect.
Okay, let's just slow that down for a second and recap it. What she says is that when she's president of the United States, she's going to identify a universe of states who have in the past produced laws that frustrate people's attempts to get abortion. And then she's going to impose a rule where those laws will have to be submitted to her Justice Department before they can become law. If you don't understand how fantastic that sounds, that would require a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment that says that Kamala Harris's Justice Department gets to review state laws that she deems eligible for review. It's her office who establishes the states that are suspect in this area and the laws that are suspect in this area and gets to review them. It's through the looking glass. It's batshit crazy. I mean, I sorry for the expletive, but there's nothing else to say. It would be like Donald Trump. I mean, let's think about what the left would, forget about the left, anybody would say if Donald Trump said, well, we've got a lot of states out there that have a history of passing laws that grant more abortions than we like. So any law that has to do with abortion that comes out of California or New York or New Jersey, my Justice Department gets to review it first, or else it doesn't become a law. Huh? No. The states got together to form the federal government. The states have plenary lawmaking authority. The whole point of the federal government is for these national laws that can't be local laws. That's why Congress's powers, Article 3, Section 8, are limited and enumerated powers. Congress has very few powers. State legislatures and state governments have what is called plenary lawmaking authority. They're the ones who make laws about every jot and tittle. The national laws are supposed to be fewer and far between, but I haven't seen any pushback on how Kamala Harris thinks this can be accomplished. To suggest it would be a good idea, this is sort of like that whole thing about Harry Reid with the Supreme Court justices. Even if it was possible, which it's not, even if it was legal, which it's not, even if she could get a constitutional amendment passed, which she can't, it would still be a horrible idea. Because eventually, if you like President Trump, it's going to be somebody who you don't like who's not Trump. And if you hate President Trump, there'll be another guy you hate after President Harris, as if that's a possibility. And then he's going to be the one in control of all these laws. It's just beyond the pale. Well, what's also beyond the pale is Kamala's friend. Maybe she was smoking dope with Jussie. We know that well, remember this guy?
I've been truthful and consistent on every single level since day one. I would not be my mother's son if I was capable of one drop of what I have been accused of. This has been an incredibly difficult time, honestly one of the worst of my entire life. But I am a man of faith, and I'm a man that has knowledge of my history, and I would not bring my family
or the movement, Jussie. He would bring his family or the movement through this. Well, as it turned out, he did. The Osundairo brothers, in addition to being Jussie's trainers and go-to source for fake race hate crimes, were also his dealers. If he needed some blow or some Molly or some weed, he got up with them and he PayPal'd them or Venmo'd them the dough, and they delivered the drugs. Well, that all was in the text record that the police were able to look at. It's one of the things that were released as part of the case file. You'll recall that the case file was sealed because Jussie's lawyers asked for it to be sealed, and then the state of Illinois, Kim Foxx's office, didn't oppose that. Well, that, of course, was an outrage. At least that's been remedied. And now Jussie, I think he's justly punished. You know, I hate to suggest that the man should be in a cage, even though his actions suggest that other people should be in a cage. But this is a good test for just an old-fashioned shunning. You know, he's off his Fox show, and anybody who gives him a job in Hollywood, at least in the immediate term, should be mocked and derided. And let a little time come to pass. And if Jussie maybe owns up and apologizes for what he did, maybe I'd watch something he was in. But obviously, this is not a man who was rewarded in his life for his critical thinking skills or his own script writing. He's a pretty face, and he thought he was a smart and important person because he got a lot of attention for saying bad things about Donald Trump. And whether you're Robert De Niro or Jussie Smollett or whoever those girls are that I forget who got in trouble for criticizing George Bush and some Bosnian trip or whatever, Dixie Chicks. Well, it's not even about necessarily shut up and play. It's just that's why you have this voice, this microphone, because you're a famous actor or musician. So it would just be like if you wanted to tell people about the dangers of carbon monoxide poisoning using your celebrity. It's like, well, that's not why you're famous, because of your scientific poisonous gas detection background. No, it's about this other thing. So let's focus on that. I'm not going to play the ukulele for you because that's not why you're here. All right? With that in mind, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. This is Scott D. Cosenza. And tell a friend. We can get that John Hickenlooper correspondent on the payroll. Thanks so much. Bye.